In April of 2020, I went into the forest near my house to photograph wildlife for the first time. I thought, what if I did this again tomorrow? What if I did it for an entire week or a month? What if I filmed wildlife in this small sliver of forest for an entire year? All 4 seasons? What would I see? What would I learn? What would I discover? A year in the forest. Every spring for 4 years, some screech owls had returned to a hole in a tree near my house, coincidentally on a street named Spring. What isn't a coincidence is why the owls chose this neighborhood. Fortunately, there are still a lot of trees around for them to find homes. Remnants of a very old woodland that occupied this area at the turn of the 19th century. This woodlot has many names, but for the purposes of this film, we'll call it the Oakwood Bush. These owls became a telltale sign of spring for me. And they didn't seem to mind that I was checking in on them from time to time. One of the questions I've always had about the Oakwood Bush was, why was it still there? Our ancestors had taken out most of the tree cover in Essex County over the last 100 years, but they left this woodlot, this small woodlot for some reason. Why wasn't the Oakwood Bush cleared away to make room for houses in the late 1950s when everything else in that area was developed? The answer to that question actually goes back further into history, over 100 years. In 1912, the entire region of Ojibwe was slated to become an industrial town for the manufacturing of American steel, similar to the city of Pittsburgh. The area of land where the Oakwood Bush now stands was bought up by land speculators. The idea was to buy up all the land in the Ojibwe area in the hopes that the land prices would skyrocket with the arrival of the thousands of steelworkers. The land speculators went as far as putting in a series of sidewalks so that potential lot buyers could go and take a look around. But none of these houses were ever built. The steel mill was delayed by the outbreak of World War I in 1914, and by the time the war ended 4 years later, the proposed steel plant had been downgraded to a much smaller one. So they weren't going to need nearly as much land to house the workers. The smaller plant created less demand for the land zoned in South Windsor and allowed for the natural regeneration of the area. Flash forward almost 110 years and many of those sidewalks are still there. So it's really just an accident of history that the Oakwood Bush still exists today. The Oakwood Sanctuary was built along the edge of the woodlot in 1968, and the sanctuary consisted of a small area of land and a pond that still exists there today. At one time, the sanctuary housed several species of waterfowl, both native and exotic. I was a student at Oakwood Elementary in the 1980s and 90s, and at that time the sanctuary was still going strong. Us kids were able to spend our recess and lunch hours observing the ducks and helping maintain the area. It was a really unique situation for us kids, one that I don't think that any of us really appreciated at the time. Now, as you can see, it's almost completely overgrown. There's still a fence there, but there's no lock on it, so people can go in there and do what they want, but there's really nothing in there other than a pond, which I'm not even sure there's water in it now because it's been so hot. A lot of great memories from here, and at the time didn't realize just how unique of an elementary school that I went to, but then thinking back on it later, oh yeah, I wish I would have come out here more. Because of the completion of the Herb Gray Parkway and the Eco Crossing, the Oakwood Bush now represents the eastern boundary of the Ojibwe Forest Complex, a series of woodland areas that stretch all the way from the shores of the Detroit River into South Windsor. Through a series of fortunate events, I was able to move back into my childhood home after being gone for nearly 20 years. So I now live in the house I grew up in, along with my wife and 2 young daughters. You can really tell in this photo how much our sycamore tree has grown over the years. When things first shut down in March of 2020, I started going out to the Oakwood Bush to take photos of birds. It was still pretty quiet for birds at that point, but my experience taught me that things would be heating up in the spring. A lot. If you recall, during those early days of the lockdown in March and early April, there wasn't a whole lot going on. This time coincided with the end of a long winter and the beginning of spring. The oakwood bush is very close to my house, close enough that I could walk there and photograph or film nature whenever I wanted. I spent a lot of my childhood in the oakwood bush, playing, building forts, and having bonfires. But we paid little attention to the creatures around us. So when I first started going out to the bush every day, I had no idea if I would be seeing a lot of different birds. But the conditions looked favorable, and similar to local birding hotspots such as Point Pelee. If you know anyone who's into bird watching or bird photography, you've probably heard them speak about warblers before. Warblers are tiny songbirds that migrate through Essex County during the month of May. Warblers are interesting to me because of how colorful they are and how varied. Some are black, others are red, some are orange and yellow. Birding photographers get a thrill out of seeing a bird we have never seen before. How did these birds evolve over millennia to look the way they do? They are truly fascinating creatures, and if you want to see one, you have to get lucky. And if you want to photograph one, well, that's tricky. These birds rarely stay put for more than a few seconds, and sometimes they're way up high in the trees, moving around with leaves and branches obscuring them. This right here, this monopod, is everything, because without it, I would be standing there with the 400mm lens extended trying to get shots of these birds. Ideally, you'd have a tripod with a fluid head, but you can get by with a monopod because you're standing in a swamp. And if you want to get some film of a warbler, well, you'll need even more luck and more time. Luckily, time is something that I had a lot of this year. I saw it as an opportunity to do something that I had always wanted to do but never had the time. So here we are, we're standing in the oakwood bush, right in the swamp. When I was a kid, I used to come out to the oakwood bush and play, and during the summer, we'd come out here, we'd build forts, we'd ride our bikes, we did everything but look at birds. And now, all these years later, I kind of came out here knowing that the pandemic was happening and I was going to be doing my bird watching here. I came out and I scoped out what places I thought would be good for birds. And this is where I came. This is the first place that I came, because no one comes back here. It's nice and quiet, and there's a lot of swamp here. There's about 50 different species of warbler throughout the United States and Canada. For about 3 weeks during the month of May, warblers flood through Essex County. But they're not feeder birds, so you have to go out to the woods to see them. Thinking that this spot is going to be amazing for birds. I started coming here in April, at the end of April, and I just knew that it was only a matter of time before that peak migration when warblers would be dropping in on all these trees all over the place. And then one day, just like that, they arrived. But not all at once. They came back in waves. First was the yellow rumped warbler. And then the American redstart started to come. I was pleasantly surprised to see a chestnut-sided warbler arrive. This same bird, a chestnut-sided warbler, had caused a photographer's frenzy at Point Pelee one year, and it was here, 300 yards away from my house. Here's the magnolia warbler. The magnolia warbler is the very first warbler I ever saw and photographed. We're standing in a swamp right now. You got to make sure that you have very high boots. And this might be hard for some people, is try to fight the urge to look at your phone. You don't want to be looking at your phone in the swamp, because if you drop it, you're done. Yes, we're standing in a muddy swamp, but it was perfect for warblers. All they eat is insects. The insects weren't bothering me yet. I don't have the blood type that they like. Whoops, a cat. The ruby-crowned kinglet is an interesting bird, smaller than a warbler. They aren't much to look at a first glance, but they have a wonderful surprise. When males become agitated or threatened, they flash their bright ruby patches on the tops of their heads. Here's a golden-crowned kinglet, another early migrant. Here's a northern water thrush, another warbler. Blackpoll warbler. I've never seen one of those before. That's my first Oakwood bush lifer. Amazing. That's 6 and counting. Here's a palm warbler scanning the swamp for insects. Sometimes you just have to be patient, and instead of chasing the birds trying to get film of them, it's best to just kind of find a spot like this right here, lean up against it, wait back, and wait for them to come to you. You get your monopod set at a nice level, try to figure out where the birds are going to go, because you just want to wait and let them fly into your frame, as opposed to, I mean, you do some of this too, trying to chase them down, but it's hard. So yeah, just be patient, wait them out. When the insects start coming, that's when your warblers are going to come. They just follow the insects. Here's a black and white warbler, one of my old favorites. I spent a little bit of time in the West Field looking for different species. Here's a yellow warbler already building a nest, one of the few warblers that builds nests locally. The bay-breasted warbler was not bothered by me one bit. Oh, the hunter saw me. Here's a black-throated blue warbler. Every time I saw a different species of warbler, I got a charge of excitement. How many different species was I going to see back here? Blackburnian warbler. Here's a Wilson's warbler. That's a surprise. Here's a very pretty bird, the Cape May warbler. Here's a male eastern towhee scrounging the forest floor looking for something to eat. One thing to remember too is bring an extra battery and bring an extra card, because you're going to run out of space on your card and your battery's going to die. There's nothing that you can do to prevent that from happening. It's happened to me. I lost some footage, or I lost an opportunity to get some footage. Here's a scarlet tanager. Not a warbler, but they often arrive at the same time as warblers. And their bright red color makes them a favorite to birders. See what else we got here. Indigo bunting would be nice. That was the one I said I'd stop. I finally got footage of an indigo bunting, and I've seen them back here before. Didn't have a camera on me that day. Indigo bunting was a good cap to the season. Again, not a warbler, but they migrate through the region at the same time as the warblers. And the bunting wasn't in the swamp, it was in the western prairie. A completely different ecosystem, and an interesting one at that. Aside from all the warblers that I saw in the swamp that spring, there were two that I saw and photographed but didn't manage to get any footage of. They were the Canada warbler and the northern Parula warbler. One bird that I did see back here was a solitary sandpiper early on, and he was just putting on a show for me, so I think maybe that's why I decided to, oh, you got time, get out the camera, start recording it. But back then I didn't have a tripod or a monopod with me, so I was trying to do it in my hand, and that's a no-no. Don't ever do that. Always bring a monopod with you. I decided to head back to the western prairie to try to find something else. I was very optimistic after seeing so many different varieties of warblers. I went out to the woods every single day that spring, and I rarely saw another human being. What I did see was 16 separate species of warbler. I was very excited about what I was going to see next. That's a bald eagle flying overhead. I wasn't expecting to see that. And here's a mother mallard tending to her ducklings. It's good to know that there's still ducks living in the Oakwood bush, even though the sanctuary is long gone now. The pond is still there, so you still see ducks taking advantage of it. This is a tufted titmouse. I once met a man who drove all the way from Montreal to Windsor just to see one of these little guys. On a rainy day when I was worried about getting my birding lens wet, I went out looking to shoot some macros of flowers. I had been seeing a lot of white trilliums in the woods and wanted to take a break from the spring birding to document them. While looking for trilliums and other forest flowers like jack-in-the-pulpit, I came across a morel mushroom. I was already familiar with morels, but I had never actually found one growing in the woods before. I did some reading up on morel mushrooms and was blown away at how interesting of a find this was, seeing them in the Oakwood bush. Morels are an extremely valuable mushroom, and the reason for that is simple. Morels can't be cultivated. In other words, they only grow in the wild. The reason for this is that morels have a symbiotic relationship with the rich soil on the forest floor. An interesting thing about morels is that once you find where they grow, they will most likely come back to that exact same spot the following year. It doesn't take long once they come out of the ground for the animals to find them and eat them. Deer and always a few snails. I kept thinking this was going to be a good spot to come and see a prothonotary warbler, but I didn't really see all that much back here. And I did find some morels over there, over on the other side. That's where I got those morels. Came out here a lot in the rain. Man, talk about it being peaceful. You're hearing the rainfall, you're protected because of the canopy, and just sitting there waiting, thinking, waiting for birds to come. On my way to the western prairie, I stopped by the old sanctuary pond to investigate some intriguing calls I had been hearing back there. Listen closely, here's an audio sample that I got of the mystery creature, hoping that I could send it off to someone to ID for me. I thought perhaps that it was some sort of owl or some other very secretive bird. I had been hearing it off and on for a while now, and I still couldn't see anything close to the sounds. So whatever it was very well camouflaged. I sent the recording that I had to some experts to try to ID it for me. One got back to me right away. It was a gray tree frog. What's more, my recording didn't just have one tree frog on it. There were up to 3 males in that recording. What made that interesting was that there hadn't been a gray tree frog in Essex County for well over 100 years. So I set out to film the gray tree frog. I got it. That's the gray tree frog. Don't know how I found it. Now we just need him to move. It took a little bit of extra time, and I finally experienced what bad mosquitoes were, but it was worth it. Why are the frogs coming back now? Where did they come from? Maybe it had something to do with the Herb Gray land bridge. I hope this population can thrive for years to come.
Something cool that I came across out here was there was a family of 3 male deer, bucks with big antlers, and they were all living together. And I see them out here from time to time. And when I go around the perimeter and I'm riding my bike on other nights, I see them all together. And talking to friends and doing a little bit of research, I found that sometimes when bucks aren't able to find a mate, they end up with other bucks, and it's called a band. It's called banding, and they all end up spending that season together.
Turkeys are something that we never saw in the Oakwood bush and surrounding neighborhood 30 years ago, but they're permanent residents now, most likely because of the eco-crossing over the Herb Gray Parkway. Now that the warblers are all gone, I was going to have to focus my attention and my camera on something else. But what next? What was left? I decided for the summer season I was going to go in for a closer look. Insects. A whole new world worth exploring with a macro lens. These insects were all new to me. I had never actually taken time to stop and study them, to watch them.
There's thousands of plants out there, and every single one of those plants has insects on it. It never fails, no matter what. Every single one of them will have some kind of bug. And you can get in really close with these macro lenses. This is a Canon 100mm macro lens. And it works basically just like a normal lens would, except it allows you to get up very, very close to the thing that you're shooting. It's incredible. You fill up the whole frame.
Now a new wish began to form in my mind, the possibilities of what I was going to see next. The possibilities seemed endless, way beyond the scope of my imagination. I wonder how long it will take this group of milkweed tussock moths to devour this milkweed leaf.
Monarch butterflies only lay their eggs on one plant, and that's milkweed. And monarchs typically only lay one egg on each milkweed plant because when the caterpillar comes out of the egg, it's going to eat every last shred of milkweed on that particular plant. and then it goes somewhere else. It forms into its chrysalis, and then a couple weeks later, you've got yourself a brand new monarch butterfly. So if you want to find monarch caterpillars, you go to the milkweed because that's where they are.
This little guy is a monarch butterfly caterpillar. In a few short weeks, it will turn into one of the most beautiful butterflies in North America and begin its perilous journey to Mexico. I had never even imagined insects like these before. I don't have a clue what this one is. I'm not even sure what to Google.
There's a lot of people out there who know a heck of a lot more about insects than I do. This is an opportunity for me to learn about them though, because you get shots of them and then you can look them up online. I can show them to some of my insect photographer buddies. They know a lot about this kind of stuff. I get an education out of it.
They ate the whole thing in less than 24 hours. Nature was exploding all around me through the months of June and July. No mosquitoes yet, but they weren't my main source of worry at this point.
One thing that's very important when you come out here is you got to make sure you put bug spray on. That'll keep some of the bugs off you. I've noticed I picked up some travelers. I got some ticks on me. So I always make sure that before I walk home, I always check every inch to make sure that there are no ticks on me, because I found them a couple times and nobody in my family is going to be too impressed with me if I show up with a couple ticks on me. And you don't want to get bit because some ticks, not all of them, but some ticks carry diseases, Lyme's disease for one, and that's a horrible disease. So whatever you can do to be safe. Now this is something for the list. See how close this thing will let me get. It's a nice one.
A praying mantis. I had seen these guys before. Most people have. They aren't shy. The praying mantis is not native to our region. And there are two separate species of them here now. The European mantis and the larger Chinese mantis. The praying mantis was introduced to North America by gardeners trying to rid their gardens of pests. A praying mantis will eat anything that it can get, even another mantis.
We talked about in the spring the benefits of having a monopod when you're going out to film birds in the swamp. Well, monopod isn't going to be much use to you at this point with a macro lens. You need a very sturdy tripod, the sturdiest tripod that you can find. This one here works like a charm. I wouldn't even bother trying to do this if I didn't have a tripod like this. Look at that. Oh, there he goes, he's on the move.
Nature is never boring. Some of the things that I was seeing couldn't really be explained, like this. What is this snail doing? What was going on here?
This here is a parabolic microphone, and I like having this because I can record actual field audio, the sounds that we're actually hearing. Unfortunately, I can't use the wild sound that I capture with the camera because you hear me breathing, you hear the camera clicking, the focus changing. The bowl reflects the audio, so it's nice and pure, and it's a shotgun mic, so you get whatever it is that you're pointing at, and you can isolate it so you're not hearing the truck traffic behind us. It's really nice.
I was really happy with so much of the footage that I had managed to get so far, but I felt I was missing out on what was happening in the area in the middle of the night. From conversations that I had with friends and naturalists, one thing that I knew I was going to have to document for this film was moths, and what moths were doing in the middle of the night. Moths. I decided to set up an ultraviolet light in my backyard to see if I was close enough to the woods to attract some really interesting moths and other insects at night. This moth is luminescent. Notice all the other bugs aren't glowing. I had never really paid too close attention to moths before. What is there to know about moths, I thought. Was the night sky in the neighborhood surrounding the oakwood bush dark enough to attract moths and other insects to a UV light? I was about to find out. I had no idea the depth of the rabbit hole I was about to fall down. Turns out that UV lights, or ultraviolet lights, are really good at attracting moths. Every once in a while, my mind would be blown by the sight of a giant moth that came to the yard. Hey, a fish fly. Hey, there's two of them. Turns out that fish flies are also attracted to UV light. This bug looks like an extra from Star Wars. This is a tufted bird-dropping moth. Imagine a moth evolving over the millennia to look like a piece of bird droppings, just so predators would ignore it. Nature was not disappointing. Moths are a lot easier to film than birds are. For obvious reasons, they're drawn towards the light source, and once they settle in, they literally just sit there. So you can get all kinds of interesting camera angles on them. This is the Ilia underwing moth. It's perfectly camouflaged to blend in with oak trees. I put in the dime for scale in some of these shots. I also like seeing all of the smaller insects and moths walking around the giants, and in some cases right over top of them. It really shows you just how large they are. One night I set up the UV light just to see if anything interesting would come by, and I was shocked when I saw this. A giant leopard moth, stunningly beautiful, something I had never seen before. It ended up hanging around the yard for 3 nights, spending its days hanging out on one of my milkweed plants. The moon plays a big role in the activity of moths. If the moon is out, you may not see them. But on the nights when the moon is hidden or not out at all, your chances of seeing moths greatly increase. On the second night, I was stunned to see that there were 2 leopard moths on the bedsheet. These giant leopard moths aren't particularly rare in our area, but a lot of people have never seen one. The reason for that is because they're nocturnal and they only come out at night, so you really have to be looking for them. Setting up the UV light in my backyard was one thing, and I was seeing a lot of interesting moths and other insects, but I still wanted to set the lights up in the actual oakwood bush. I needed to find out what, if anything, I was missing. I asked a friend whose backyard empties out onto the oakwood bush if I could set up there for an evening. He said no problem and even provided me with an extension cord to plug my lights into. And wow, I immediately noticed an increase in overall insect volume, and I started to see some larger moth specimens as well. Here's an Io moth. Another giant leopard moth. And then this, the granddaddy of them all, a Polyphemus moth. It was massive. When it first arrived, I thought it was a bat. That's how big it was. It was a beautiful specimen. 2 features immediately stood out to me. First, the antenna array, and also the eye spots on the wings. It was simply stunning. To think that these beautiful creatures only live for 3 days and have no ability to eat or even drink. Its sole purpose is to find a mate in the darkness, just to carry on the species. That's why it needs those massive antennae. These monarch caterpillars were getting bigger and bigger, and they never stopped eating their milkweed.
Luckily, a lot of the things that you're filming with a macro lens aren't going to fly away on you, so you can get as close as you possibly can to them. And one thing that I like to do to get closer without actually moving the tripod is you just take the leg and extend the leg, and then you can be stable and you can get that much closer. Every inch counts with a macro lens.
After the moths, I really started to take notice of all the different butterfly varieties that were present around the oakwood bush.
If you're really patient, you can find out what kind of flowers and plants attract the butterflies, and you can just go and stake it out and wait for them to come. A lot of the times they'll land on the same purple flowers and then kind of do a circuit, and then they'll eventually come back to where they started, just looking for more nectar. After they fly away, I recommend keeping the camera on that flower a little bit longer because they might come back to that same plant right away. And then people who are watching that video will look at it and say, how the heck was he filming that flower when that butterfly happened to land on it?
The monarchs had finally arrived.
An interesting thing about the monarch is birds know that the monarch is poisonous if they eat it. So its colors are kind of a warning sign to birds to stay away, because the birds know that they'll just get sick if they eat one. So there's another butterfly out there called the viceroy that's evolved, there goes one there, that is evolved over time to mimic the exact patterns of a monarch butterfly. They're not identical, but they're close enough that a bird won't eat a viceroy either because it thinks it's a monarch. That type of thing is just fascinating to me. How that happened over evolution, it's incredible. Another thing I talked about in the spring was the idea of not bringing your cell phone or not having your cell phone out while you're standing in the swamp. One thing that it's good to have a phone for when you, with the birds, is that you can quickly identify what you're looking at. I don't have an app like that for insects, so I don't even bother to bring my phone with me because it's just a distraction when you could be scanning the horizon to try to find a colored butterfly that you've never seen before and try to track it down.
I couldn't figure out why this black swallowtail butterfly was letting me get so close and not flying away. And then it occurred to me that perhaps it had just emerged from its cocoon and was about to take its very first flight. This little guy is a black swallowtail caterpillar. They grow very fast. When a black swallowtail caterpillar believes it's in danger from a predator, it will release these glands called osmeterium. The osmeterium emit a foul odor which will repel predators.
So aside from the monarchs, you see the giant swallowtail butterflies, and they're really, really cool. They're quite a bit bigger than a monarch, and when you get a good close look at their tails, you can see that nature has given them what looks like eyes on the back side of their wings. That's to trick predators. Specifically, it's to trick birds, because birds will go for the eyes, and all they usually come up with is a couple pieces of the butterfly wing, which really doesn't take the butterfly out of commission. It can go on flying with large portions of its wings missing sometimes. You'd be surprised at how depleted their wings can get, and they're still able to take flight and flutter around. This field that we're in right now is so unique and so special. The amount of butterfly traffic that I see coming through here, there's a place up there, a point in between all those trees. I call it a choking point or a bottleneck, and the way that it's shaped, all the butterflies have to pass through there, and they're coming right from the other side of the Herb Gray Parkway. They have no choice but to come right through here. Sometimes you look out and you can see 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 butterflies at a time.
When I said that I spent a good chunk of my childhood playing in the Oakwood bush, building forts, and having bonfires, while not paying attention to the birds, one creature that we were paying attention to back then was snakes. Specifically, the garter snakes. Decades ago, when the Ambassador Bridge was built, the road feeding the bridge, Huron Church, became one of the busiest roads in all of North America. Non-stop truck traffic, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Huron Church Road became a boundary for a lot of animals, but it made Oakwood Bush a forest island of sorts for snakes. Crossing one of the busiest roads in North America can be problematic for snakes, as I'm sure you can imagine. Since the construction of the Herb Gray Parkway, and specifically the eco crossings that go over top of it, more snakes can now cross over into the Oakwood Bush. Garter snakes eat earthworms, frogs, slugs, leeches, and some smaller mammals. In all my years of playing in the Oakwood bush and walking to and from school and building countless forts, we never saw any fox snakes in the woods. So you can imagine my surprise when I came across this snake. This was the first time I ever saw a fox snake in the Oakwood bush. Fox snakes in particular make me nervous, maybe because they're so big. I have to admit that it's not natural for me to want to be around snakes. I know that these snakes are harmless to me and to other humans, but I'm still a little bit anxious when I'm around them. An adult fox snake can grow as big as 6 feet in length. And when fox snakes sense danger, they will shake their tail on the grass to imitate the sound of a Massasauga rattler. Another reminder of the genius of Mother Nature and evolution. The fox snake's return to the Oakwood bush is an amazing thing, and I think that the eco-crossing plays a huge role in that. I got a few shots of the fox snake, and it was hard for me because I was shaking so much, being nervous. But I maintained a respectful distance, and then I left it alone. I had gotten my shots, and I was satisfied. I saw at least 2 more fox snakes that summer. Each one appeared to be over 5 feet in length. I left no stone unturned. I could always find something. Sometimes I had to dig a little. I felt like I was watching these does grow up.
Well, I gotta say it was fun filming all these insects and butterflies this summer, and I hate to quit doing this, so I want to keep going. I want to do this for the whole year. So leading into the fall, I don't exactly know what it's going to be yet, but I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be able to find it out here in the field, so I think I'm going to head back into the woods for this next season. So let's go have a look. It's a whole other world. Now that all the leaves have fallen, most of the leaves have fallen, you can get a clear shot of the birds that are left. A lot of them have migrated south, but there's still some remnants floating around. See some bluebirds out here this time of year, hawks, the geese flying south. There's still plenty to see out here. The deer, saw some bucks earlier. They haven't shed their antlers yet, and they're looking really, really big. Let's go into the bush and see what we can see.
These were not morels. This one gave me an upset stomach just looking at it.
A lot of the leaves that we see on the forest floor are good. It's like a blanket for a lot of the insects that they really just burrow into the ground and go dormant. They have nowhere else to go. It's not like they can fly south. They don't just die. They just go dormant, and then in the spring, when everything thaws, they thaw out too, and they just go about their business. It wouldn't take much. You start kicking around some of the leaves before you find something. Leaves. Yeah, that didn't take long. There's a little centipede down there. Make sure we cover them back up when we leave. So it's been about 8 months now coming out to the bush looking for different things. And one of the most exciting things that's come up is that there's actually a really rare raccoon out here. It's an albino raccoon. It's all white. I've seen some photos of it that some of the people from the neighborhood got, and it's really, really cute. They say that the odds of spotting a white raccoon is the same odds as getting struck by lightning twice. It seems like it's hard to find a raccoon unless you're not looking for a raccoon, and then they're very easy to find. You might think that since it's getting colder and it's fall and we're getting into the winter that a lot of the birds are gone. And that's true, a lot of them are gone. But then think about it like this, that there's birds from the far north that this is their south, so that when they go hundreds of miles to the south, this is where they end up. There's creatures like snowy owls, there's nuthatches, red-breasted nuthatches. They all come down here because it's a lot warmer than what they're used to. And some years you get an explosion of the population because they can't find the food that they need for the winter up north, so they come down here. There's another one of those hornets' nests. There's a whole bunch of things out here that you don't see when all the leaves are on the trees. And then once all the leaves are gone, boom, all kinds of stuff. What a big difference it makes when there's no leaves on the trees. You can see through the whole bush. I've noticed that there's a lot of cats out here too. It started off as just one and I thought it was a one-off. Then I came out here again and I started seeing more and more cats. They're everywhere. And then I was talking to some of the neighborhood people and it says, yeah, there's quite a few cats out there, which could be a bad thing for the birds if you think about it.
I couldn't really ignore the fact that I was starting to see a lot of cats in the Oakwood bush. And it's not like I was seeing the same ones over and over again. These seem to all be different. We never saw stray cats living in the Oakwood bush back in the 80s and 90s. They could be somebody's pet from the surrounding neighborhood, but it's also likely that they're a part of a feral population living out there now.
Yeah, a lot of people who live around here that I talk to have been talking about hearing coyotes howling at night. I've got these trail cams now, so I can come out here and set up the trail cams and see if I can get any footage of the coyotes. Talking about in the spring of making sure you have enough batteries and you have enough cards. And sure enough, this fall, I was walking back home, I looked up and I saw an eastern bluebird, two of them, sitting in a tree, and my battery was dead. I had just enough where I was able to get away with a little bit of footage, and I thought, oh, that's okay, I'll just come back tomorrow. The eastern bluebirds are always around. But I haven't seen it since. Broke my own rule, came back to bite me a little bit. To finish things off for the winter, I'd like to keep coming out here once in a while, and I'd just like to keep documenting some of the creatures that I've been seeing out here for almost a year now. I've been coming out here for 8 months already, and there's the same creatures: deer, certain types of birds, raccoons, cats, and then there's those things that are on my list that I want to try to see that I haven't seen yet. So there's the coyotes that I've heard but I haven't seen yet. I think I'll get them with the trail cams, hopefully.
I had never been a huge fan of winter, especially when it came to bird watching. Most of my favorite birds were long gone by now, having gone south for the winter. It's a shame too, because all the leaves are off the trees at this point, and it's really easy to see what's left. But this year was different. I was ready to embrace the cold weather. In the winter, after all the leaves are gone from the trees, you really get a sense of just how small the oakwood bush is.
So here we are, it's the middle of February. There's tons of snow on the ground, but the sun's out, so it's not too cold. There's all kinds of birds still passing through. I just saw a duck fly by, surprisingly. I see some squirrels off in the distance resting on branches, getting some sun rays in, and saw some woodpeckers. I don't even know if you can see my breath. But the snow's on the ground. The snow's been on the ground for a few days. Still looking for owls out here. Haven't found any. I can hear them when I come out here at night. I've got some recordings of that. That's pretty cool. And then coyotes, of course. Been hearing the coyotes in the neighborhood. Neighbors of mine have been calling me, telling me that they've been hearing sounds of coyotes. The thing with the coyotes is they're so smart. You can't really sneak up on a coyote. You have to get lucky with a coyote. And so I've decided that I want to try to make my own luck with the coyote. So I got a special kind of camera. It's called a trail cam. And what I can do with this is I can set it up anywhere I want out here. We know they're out here. We just saw some evidence of one down the path a little way, so we know they're out here. I'm really excited to try it. I talked in the spring about having come out to this woodlot, this oakwood bush, since I was a little kid and we played out here. At that time, there were no deer out here. There were no turkeys. There were no coyotes, nothing like that. And I think that the reason that there is now is because it's accessible to these animals' populations. You've got the Herb Gray Parkway over here with the Lamb Bridge, which has done so much to diffuse the wildlife from west of here into this region. which up until now had been an island, isolated on its own on the other side of one of the busiest roads in all of North America. Now they're able to come back here freely. Maybe that's how the tree frog got over here. Maybe that's how the coyote, the deer, they don't have to cross that busy road anymore. There's fox snakes out here now. So since it's winter, it is cold out, so I haven't been coming out here as much. I have been coming out here just to take pictures with the DSLR, and who knows what you're gonna see. Maybe you'll see something I can switch over to video and get some footage that way, but get a lot of nice stills on a day like today when the sun is shining. I haven't been hauling all my video gear out here, but one thing I have been doing is I've got a really nice vantage point from my kitchen window looking out. I've got some feeders set up in my backyard. I've been able to constantly be filming stuff all winter, all kinds of different birds, so I know what's still around. They're very, very connected still because there's a lot of old growth in that neighborhood. So everything kind of runs through there and we see them at the feeder.
How many different species of bird would I be able to observe out my kitchen window over the winter months? Would I get any surprises? Here's a stray cat that I had never seen before. And here's a robin covered in snow. So much for robins being a sign of spring. Pine siskin, that's a nice backyard bird. I think filming birds through a window works so well because at certain times of the day when the sun is right, the birds can't see you on the other side of the glass. The Carolina wren was a nice bird to see in the backyard, and I've seen it back there before, but they don't sit still for very long. A female redpoll, a lifer for me, and to see one in the backyard. Wow! And the cute tufted titmouse. I still wanted to see if I could track down an owl, and I wasn't certain I would be able to do that in my backyard, so on a cold night in the middle of February, I headed out into the woods in the wee hours of the night to try to record some screech owl sounds. And who knows what else I might record.
I am getting very close to where I heard that owl the other night, so we might have something soon. And boy, is it cold. I hear an owl. Just gonna try to zero in on it now. That's a good one. I'm getting close. That's how close that thing is now. This tree they're in is a great big cedar tree. There's no chance of seeing it, but you can really hear it.
It's so quiet on the streets right now, and with the headphones on and the audio recorder turned up all the way, I feel like I have super hearing. I might be able to hear one from 2 blocks away. Sometimes you can hear them calling back and forth to each other. People say there's not that much to do nature-wise in the winter, but that's not true. Special circumstances, I'm out here at 1 o'clock in the morning trying to hear something. There's nothing else like the sound of a screech owl. Well, that was kind of fun. I think I'll leave him be and head back home. So I've got some good recordings of a screech owl. I think it was just one, but it's still kind of cool.
I've been enjoying the winter. It's like the cold kind of gives everything a clean slate, sets the table for the spring for all the new growth and everything that comes. So really looking forward to spring, but the winter hasn't been that bad of an experience. I've enjoyed my time coming out here. We will see you in the spring.
Including the screech owl, I managed to see or hear 21 separate creatures in our backyard over the winter months, including a few surprises. The redpoll in particular was a huge surprise for me. Although I had enjoyed the winter, I was still bubbling over with anticipation for the spring and the possibilities of what it might bring. At long last, spring had arrived, and I was still trying to tie up some loose ends. Almost an entire year in the forest, and I still hadn't seen a coyote. And then one night, the trail cams paid off. It's only 3 stills and 10 seconds of video, but I finally managed to get some footage of a coyote in the Oakwood bush. What a surprise that was. Another surprise was that there were so many deer in the woods. Deer and raccoons. I couldn't tell if any of the raccoons that I captured on the trail cam were pure white. What do you think?
I noticed this spring that the warblers weren't as great as they were in the spring of 2020. 2021 was an off year for warblers, and I think that's because there's a drought. We had lots of rain, but one thing that we didn't have was a lot of snow in the winter, and I think that's what determines how much water will be in the swamp, is how much melt water there is from the snow that accumulates over the winter. So yeah, the warblers were down, unfortunately, but I still got a few. I was never disappointed coming out here. No matter what, it seemed like I would always get at least one photo that I liked, or some video, a little bit of video that I liked. It seemed to never fail. To this day, we still come out here and I'm still bombarded with things that I haven't seen yet. I used to get bummed out at the end of spring because that meant that the bird season was over and it would be another year before we get to start again every May. But that's changed now this last year coming out here. Now I look forward to the summer just as much as I do the spring because everything's so great out here with the insects, you know, and I really got into the macro photography and the macro filming that just keeps ramping up through the summer months. It gets better and better and better. I was trying to think of some of the highlights of things that I've seen back here over the last year, and one of them for sure was the fox snake, which was right around this area, and they're really well camouflaged, so you have to be careful where you're walking, where you step when you come through here, because you don't want to step on one, not because they'll hurt you, but because you might hurt them. That was one of the highlights. The other highlight was the gray tree frog. Now the gray tree frog is back. I saw it again this spring, which is amazing. I wasn't able to get any footage of them, but I certainly heard them and I have recordings of that. I saw so many different species of animals and insects out here over the past year. But one other thing that I saw that was quite fascinating were all these different types of plants and flowers. And there's specific flowers and plants to this region that are only found in a few places in all of Canada. Learning about orchids that grow back here. I didn't know that there was an orchid flower that grew in this field. I talked about earlier how the Oakwood bush is just here through an accident of history. Something that happened 100 years ago that led to a chain of events that allowed for it to still be here in 2021, 2022. So we're really lucky that way, and the Oakwood bush is protected. It's going to be part of this huge plan they have to make this whole area into a national urban park. So that's really nice that this is kind of the eastern tip of that forest complex that spreads all the way to the Detroit River from here. So those are some areas that I'd like to explore and see things that I wasn't able to see out here, like some of the sturgeon in the Detroit River, some of the great horned owls that live in the Spring Garden area, bitterns and sora, prothonotary warblers, those types of things that I was never able to see in the Oakwood bush. But just because this area is protected now doesn't mean we should let our guard down. We have to make sure that this area is taken care of for future generations, our children, our grandchildren. They'll have something like this that's so special and unique that they can come and see for themselves. Okay, how can I do that differently?
There was always something new to see, a new discovery waiting just around the corner. You just have to know where to start looking.